I am Janine Raymond, the Assistant Vice Chancellor for Human Resources, and I'd like to welcome those of you in the room and also those who may be watching this streamed session. This is the kickoff of Staff Appreciation Week, the second year that we are doing this. And I have to share with you, last year when the Planning Committee got together for the first time and was brainstorming about what to schedule or line up for the week, somebody asked, gee, could we have a faculty member maybe share their research? Because most of the staff don't get to hear from the faculty who are really the foundation of Berkeley's academic excellence. So we asked, and they were enthusiastic and they shared, and hopefully this will become perhaps a tradition for kicking off Staff Appreciation Week. So today it's my pleasure to introduce to you a person who many of you know as our new Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, Claude Steele, but today he's here as a faculty member sharing his research. So he's best known for his research on the psychological experience of the individual, particularly the experience of threats to the self and the consequences of those threats. His earlier work dealt with research on self-image, self-affirmation, as well as the role of self-regulation in addictive behaviors. In 2010, he released his book, Whistling Vivaldi and Other Clues to How Stereotypes Affect Us, summarizing years of research on stereotype threat and the underperformance of minority students in higher education. The recipient of many prestigious awards that acknowledge his contributions to the academic community, please join me in welcoming Claude Steele, Professor of Psychology and the Graduate School of Education.
Well, thank you. It is a real pleasure to be here and an honor to be asked to give the talk that launches Staff Appreciation Week. You depend on the kindness of strangers. I certainly depended on the kindness of staff. and that appreciation is heartfelt on my part, especially as you move into a university. And I've been blessed with really good staff who helped me and made me feel at home. And so, and I also feel staff and staff morale are really a big part of the sort of backbone of a university's morale. And so I really think it's appropriate to have this kind of week, and I'm especially honored to have a chance to kick off the week of appreciation. I would like to just talk about my research over the last couple of decades, I can put it that way. It focuses around two social psychological phenomenon or experiences, stereotype threat and social identity threat. These are experiences that I think everybody has. We have them in relation to one of our social identities or another, probably on an almost daily basis. So they're very common features of everyday life and everybody's experience. I'm going to be arguing today that with regard to certain groups whose abilities are negatively stereotyped in some domain or another, these threats that are kind of garden variety things, they can conspire to be quite serious pressures on, downward pressures on performance and identification with those domains. So I'm going to be arguing that even though these things happen to everybody, and they're sort of garden variety social psychological experiences, that in certain circumstances they can be powerful effects on our performance, important performances that we care about, intellectual performances, athletic performances, musical performances, a whole variety of things. I'm going to make the case that these are big deals and not little deals, but I don't want to be depressing. So I definitely want to get to the part of the talk where we talk about remedies, both things that institutions can do, sort of an institutional skill set with regard to handling these pressures, and individual skill set with regard to handling these pressures. How do we as individuals cope with this kind of thing, get past these threats? So that's the general ambition of the talk. There'll probably be about three sections. One thing I like to convey in talking about this research is the sort of mystery novel feature of being a scientist, that you often start out with a question and you don't know what the answer is. So I want to tell the research in that kind of chronological order. So you see what the mystery was, and then you see kind of what the answer was, and then kind of how we got to the solutions that we wind up proposing, and then you can follow our thought process that way. The book that I wrote about this describes the work in that way to give you some sense of how science actually happens, which is a lot more kind of reaching in the dark and so on than I think it looks sometimes. So anyway, I want to give you that impression. So first I'll talk about the mystery that we found that launched this research. Then I'll zoom ahead, I'll spare you all the wandering in the wilderness. I'll jump over about 7 or 8 years or so and give you the answer that we came up with. And some examples of that. I want to just make it not so much a science talk, but more a talk of sort of conveying the experience of stereotype threat and what that's like. So I'll try to do that. Then we'll talk about what causes it, what makes it weakens it, what makes it stronger, and then perhaps obviously from there into what we can do about it, how we can manage it. Okay. The mystery is the following mystery, that for groups whose abilities are negatively stereotyped in some domain of life, mathematics, STEM fields, athletics, music, pick your domain, where a group is negatively, or maybe even intergroup relations. That could be an area where a group has negatively stereotyped. What you find is that when members of those groups are working at the frontier of their skills in that domain, when they're really working, pushing themselves in that domain, mysteriously, their performance is often worse than other people in that domain, other people who are not stereotyped, even though they have the same skills, preparation, and talents. That's the mystery. Why would that happen? And I can remember to this day discovering this for the first time. I talk about this in the book too, that being on a faculty committee at the University of Michigan years ago and seeing the grades for the grade averages for Michigan students graphed out as a function of the SAT score they had when they entered college. So you see, generally speaking, that kids who entered with higher SAT scores tended to get higher grade point averages on the whole. That's what that line goes up there. But then they broke the line out for a special line out for African American students. And at every level of SAT, they were getting lower grades than other students at Michigan. And that was mysterious to me. Why would that be the case? Until that moment, I believed quite solidly that if you had the same preparation and skills as roughly measured by the SAT, I'm not going to certainly stress that that's a great measure. We can come back to that later. But, roughly speaking, you'd think that they would be doing as well as everybody else with the same SAT. And this was true way out on the high end of the scale. Kids with, in those days, almost perfect SAT scores were getting lower at lower grades than other kids with perfect SAT scores, and so on down the line. Why would that happen? Then we, within weeks, found out that the same thing was happening to women in advanced math courses at the University of Michigan. The exact same pattern. They were getting lower grades than men in those courses, even though their SATs were exactly the same at every level of SAT. That was what was happening. And then, of course, we found that this wasn't true just for the University of Michigan. It's true everywhere. It's called underperformance. It's a well-known phenomenon in the psychometric literature. People had various kinds of explanations or ways of kind of sweeping it under the rug, but it's a very reliable phenomenon. We could walk into probably any class on this campus and look at the grade point averages as a function of the SATs that the kids in that class had coming into it, and we would see underperformance for groups whose abilities are negatively stereotyped in the content of that domain. We would see that. It would be very, sometimes it doesn't happen, sometimes it's small, Sometimes it's huge, but it is almost lawful in American society at almost any level of schooling, Stanford Medical School, a law school, anywhere. So the commonness of the phenomenon told us it was important and that we should take it seriously and think about it. And I just had a hunch that there could be something social psychological about that. I'm a social psychologist, I guess that's no surprise, but I just had some hunch, some intuition that there was a piece of psychology that might explain this, it might help us understand it. So we embarked on a program of research, digging around, trying to find out what might be causing this, what was happening. I'll spare you all that, and I'll come to the conclusion, which is the idea that by and large, this phenomenon is due to this phenomenon we call stereotype threat. By and large, it seems to be due to that. There probably are some other causes in certain circumstances of underperformance. But by and large, when you've got everything equal and you still get an underperformance, it does seem to be a sort of psychological thing. And the psychological experience that we point to in explanation is stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is a very simple thing. It's simply being in a situation or doing something for which a negative stereotype about one of your identities, your race, your age, your region of the country, your gender, is relevant. When that's the case, you're doing something and a negative stereotype about one of your identities is relevant to what you're doing, you know at some level that you could be judged in terms of that stereotype. And if you care about the thing that you're doing, if it's important to you in some way, the prospect of being reduced to a stereotype like that is upsetting and distracting. And it can interfere immediately with performance, and it can make the experience of being in a domain of life, a walk of life where that kind of threat is a common feature, it can make it just less attractive. And, I don't want to do that. I just don't feel comfortable in that situation. And that's what stereotype threat is. It's very similar to any kind of negative human judgment. I give the example of in everyday life. I used to have a dear aunt who on Thanksgiving would sort of accuse our family of showing off by bringing dishes to the dinner that were especially elaborate and generous. And she wanted everything to be more simple and, straight ahead. And so there we are on Thanksgiving morning preparing the dishes. And it was if that aunt was right there in the room with us. You're kind of evaluating everything against what you think she's going to think. Well, that's just the power of a human judgment. She's kind of made this allegation and put it in the air out there about you, and now you're kind of having to contend with it, whether you like it or not. It's there. And that's kind of what stereotype threat is like. It's an allegation about your group, one of your identities, and you're now in a situation where that allegation is relevant to what you're doing. You just start to feel like you have to deal with it at some level or another. You have to push it back. You have to disprove it. You have to ignore it. You have to contend with it in some way, and that's the idea. I've been trying to get just to illustrate the generality of the phenomenon, examples of it where it's in an unusual form. So like, where would somebody who's white be under negative stereotype threat, under stereotype threat for an intellectual performance, for something that's intellectual? And we puzzled with this for a while, and one of my students came up with the idea, well, it would be in rapping. Rapping. How do you, that's a clearly intellectual exercise, but it's an African American form. And so it's also a form in which whites don't have a real positive reputation in that area. And so if you're white and you want to be a rapper, you might find yourself under the kind of stereotype threat that, say, African Americans are under in advanced schooling in general. So that was the idea. And we came up with a great clip I'll show you of Eminem, the great white rapper. And this is his biography movie, 8 Mile. I don't know how many of you have seen this. These are the first scenes in the movie. And just in the way of background, I needed to be schooled on this, I have to say. But a typical rapping event is where two rappers are on stage, and there's a coin flip, and one rapper goes first. And going first means you have to think up some horrifying insults to make about the other rapper who's standing there on the stage. And you have to do it in time and in rhyme and in front of this pulsing audience that's evaluating everything you do. And then the poor other guy who lost the coin flip and has to go second, he has to now defend himself, counter the punches that have been thrown by the first rapper. And again, he has to do it on the spot, he has to do it in time, and he has to do it in rhyme in front of everybody. So the negative stereotype here is white with a mic. That's the stereotype, white with a mic. Man, you're like white with a mic. That's not cool. So here's Eminem trying to get through some of his first experiences.
Scared to living the life that is diamonds and guns. There's numerous ways you can choose to earn funds. Some get shot, locked down, and turn nuns. Cowardly hearts and straight up shook ones.
He's a little nervous. He's getting ready to go on.
You think you're going?
Going backstage, I'm in the battle.
You can't go backstage.
Man, come on, dog. I got a stamp on my hand,
You gotta
man.
go around front.
Man, you just seen me,
I didn't
dog.
see
I just
nothing.
came from
Out front,
went to,
just like
man, you
everybody
just seen me. I just went to the
Out front,
battle.
just like everybody else. I think you better
We did have to edit.
straight, dog. He's straight. He with you?
Yeah.
Okay, cool, Future. But I think I can spin that.
I'ma murder this man. He the type to lose a fight with. They don't laugh cause you whack, they laugh cause you white with a mic. You a laughing stock, you know when it's laughing stop? When you will ever last, ass get popped. You a wigger that invented rhyme for
DJ, kick it.
Kind of a rough day there for Eminem. One thing I want you to keep in mind are the experiences he has coming on stage, because they show kind of all the cues in the environment around him that tell him how he might be seen, that tell him he could be seen in terms of a stereotype, how he's treated. He's not seen as really legitimate in that situation. He has to have somebody who is legitimate in the situation vouch for him in that situation. So these cues are kind of giving anybody an impression that there's a view of you based on some identity that you've got here, and you're going to have to contend with that in some way. And that piles up a pressure on him, which in that situation he doesn't overcome. Now, if you've seen the rest of the movie, you know that's what the movie's about, is him getting over this. And he got over it, of course, brilliantly. I mean, he was one of the great rappers of all time. There's a very positive ending to this story, but it is, as I think there is often the case, positive endings to stories of this stereotype threat and the like, but it is something that has to be overcome. So one next question is, does this threat play a role in school? And I've got another clip that I think illustrates this, and it comes from something you may have seen too. This is the blue-eyed, brown-eyed experiment of many years ago. I don't know if you have or you haven't, but Jane Elliott is like, I guess, a 7th grade teacher in Riceville, Iowa, and the day after Martin Luther King is assassinated, she is so upset. She wants to give her class some kind of an experience that would tell them what his life was about in some way, that this is a very homogeneous, all-white community, Riceville, Iowa, and she wants to do something that would give her class a sense of what King's life was about, what he meant. So she stays up all night and she sews and irons collars that you put around your neck out of felt that are either blue or brown. And the next day she goes to school and she has the brown-eyed kids put the brown collars on in the classroom. And she then proceeds to stigmatize them. This is not a demonstration you could ever do in modern with modern IRBs. You know, she'd be arrested for this. This experiment, you can go online and see some of the original footage and some of the follow-up footage and what happened to these kids as adults now, because they're obviously much older at this point than they were in 1968 when this was done. But that's what she does. And she says that the students it's known that brown-eyed students are not as smart as blue-eyed students. They don't smell as good. They don't play fair. And I think they should get up and move to the back of the classroom. And she makes them get up. And the camera sees this expression on these kids' face. They're just devastated by this. This is a teacher they love. And they hear this and they go to the back of the classroom, and then the camera follows them around all day. And you see how that experience of stigmatization affects them. Then the next day, the only fair thing in this whole experiment is that she flips the tables, and the next day she does the same thing to the blue-eyed students that she'd done to the brown-eyed students the day before. So she has them put on blue collars, and she gets up and makes the same kind of speech about how they're not good and smart and so on and so forth, and they have to move to the back of the classroom. And they've now had a genuine, if passing, thank God, experience with intense stigmatization, being seen that way. So one of the things that's interesting is a kind of small part of the videotape. This was done by ABC News. Is her on a side table with some of the kids, and they're working through a problem deck. And what she is keeping track of as they work through this deck of problems with cards, she's given them like this, is how fast do they work through the problem deck. And what you see here is the effect of having the collar on or not having the collar on, being in a stigmatized status or not being in a stigmatized status, on an intellectual performance like how fast kids are working through a problem deck in school. So here's this one.
I use Orton Gillingham Phonics. We used the card pack. And the children, the brown-eyed children, were in the low class the first day, and it took them 5.5 minutes to get through the card pack. The second day, it took them 2.5 minutes. The only thing that had changed was the fact that now they were superior people.
I thought you were going to give me. You went faster than I've ever had anyone go through the card pack. Why couldn't you get them yesterday? We had those collars on. You think the collars kept you? Just keep thinking about those collars. I took your roller up.
Oh, and you couldn't think as well with the collars on.
Well,
4 minutes and 18 seconds.
I know we weren't going to make it.
How long did it take you yesterday?
3 minutes. minutes. 3 minutes. How long did it take you today?
4 minutes and 18 seconds.
What happened?
One down.
Why? What were you thinking of?
This.
So, you know, that's a heavy-handed implementation of stigma, and you wonder, well, but most of everyday life isn't like that. Could stigmas that you don't even do anything to arouse, could they be as powerful as that? So that's where our research enters the picture. And the very first experiment we did 20 years ago looked at this effect on women's performance in math. And it's a very simple experiment. We got very, very good sophomore men and women at the University of Michigan, very good in math students. And we brought them into the lab one at a time, and we gave them a very difficult section of the graduate record exam, a half-hour section of the exam you take if you're a math major, not the general quantitative section, but this tough section that I couldn't begin to answer one item on. This is hard stuff. But these were math students. They were deeply identified with it. They'd all been selected for having, again, the same level of skill. The women had taken just as many math courses, gotten just as good at grades in high school, and had the same SAT scores. And so we had them carefully matched. But our reasoning was, if this stereotype threat idea was correct, if it had any merit to it, that this would be a different experience for women than it would be for men. For men, as they took this test that we knew was going to be frustrating, because we'd made it so difficult, it had to be frustrating, that the frustration would, for men, maybe raise the idea that, geez, maybe I'm not as good at math as I thought I was, because but that would kind of be it. There would be some anxiety, but for women, there would be an additional anxiety in that situation. They would have the same one I just described for men, but they'd also have this other thought. Maybe what they say about women is true. No, that couldn't be true. That could not be. I will not accept that that's true. And so that they would be kind of, because they care about math, they're invested in math. Here they are in a difficult math test, experiencing frustration. Maybe this extra level of consideration would come in, and they would perform worse than men who we knew were just as skilled as them, the standard structure of the underperformance effect. And that's exactly what happened. Women performed, even though they had the same preparation, everything, a full standard deviation worse than men in that situation. Now, our colleagues quickly jumped on that result, saying, well, maybe the stereotype is true. Maybe there is a biological difference that manifests itself on difficult math, and maybe you've picked it up. That's all you got there. You gave, what have you really got? So, as is the case in research, you're often humbled and worried. We were really worried. I talk about this a lot in the book because this put a lot of tension in our laboratory. You're close to finding something you didn't want to find. And you just kind of had wandered into it, and there you were. So we had to come up with another condition of the experiment that would take the stereotype threat out of the situation, do the experiment just as I described it, but this time have it be an experience for which women didn't feel any stereotype threat. And if it was stereotype threat that had repressed their performance, by taking it out, their performance should go up and match that of equally skilled men. And we had to find a way to get stereotype threat out of that testing situation. And this took forever, like a year of just thinking. And eventually we came up with something extremely simple, kind of dumbheaded, which was we did the experiment over again, equally skilled men and women, highly invested in math, take the same half-hour difficult math exam, except this time, before they sat down to take it, all of them, men and women, we told them, look, you may have heard that women don't do as well as men on difficult standardized math tests, but that's not true for the test you're taking today. Not this particular test. On this test, women always do as well as men. That's all we said, and women's math performance with that instruction matched that of equally skilled men. And this was mind-blowing to us, and I can't tell you how relieving. I mean, the tensions that were going on in the laboratory and even around the social psychology program at Michigan at the time were, what are you doing? You are just playing with fire here. But the result saved everything. So it was one of the better days of my research career, I have to say. We replicated it and replicated it. We would always get it. Always get it. Then we tried it, I moved to Stanford, we tried it with race. We compared white and black students. College, I'm going to give you an experiment that we didn't do, but that was modeled on one we did because it's kind of cooler in some respects than the study we actually did. But they gave them, white and black college students, a nonverbal IQ test, the Raven's Progressive Matrices IQ test. Each item is a big matrix, big square with a design on it. And then there are 5 little designs, and you have to pick which of the 5 little designs matches the big design. That's all you got to do. And it seems so simple when you begin. It's nonverbal, so it's seen as sort of the gold standard of IQ tests. And you just go along, and it's like, man, this is like easy. I am really smart. And then it gets really hard to do that. It gets frustrating. And at that point, that frustration, we argued, for African American students could trigger the relevance of that negative stereotype about their intellectual ability that exists in this society. And they could go through the same worry I just described for women taking the math test. That, geez, does this mean, this could not mean, yeah, forget that, that is, but all the time you're fighting off that interpretation, you're using your cognitive resources to do that rather than to take the test. And you're remembering what your parents say, just push through this. Just ignore the stereotype. All that is going on, and it is kind of blocking and so sure enough, when you do that, you get African American students scoring a standard deviation, 15 points on a regular IQ point on average IQ test, lower than white students. You get exactly the difference that exists in the population at general when you do that. But, and here's the good news, if you eliminate stereotype threat in this situation, and in this experiment, this is why I like this experiment, it's so cool, because when you use the Raven progressive matrices, you don't have to call that, it doesn't look like a test, it looks like a puzzle. And so you could just tell the students, the test takers, that you're not taking it, you don't even mention a test, you're just saying, we're just working with this puzzle today, just do the best you can. This puzzle can't measure anything about you, any cognitive abilities or anything, it's just a puzzle, just have fun. And when you're doing a puzzle, frustration is fun. That's what you're doing there. You want that. So when you give that instruction, black students perform as well as the white students on that test. So, this was giving us confidence that this phenomenon was real and could begin to, and has an impact on something like the underperformance that I described for you at the outset. I would say, especially I try to develop this in the book, that stereotype threat is, in an important area, is a condition of life. It's not something that goes away in a quick place. It's also highly local. If you go to Poland, as we did, where there is very little gender stereotype about math, half the physicists, half the engineers, half the STEM field people are women, you don't get much in the way of stereotype threat. Stereotypes are peculiar to a given society and a given history. It's like the way history visits us in our contemporary life. That's kind of how you think about it. And each group in some domain often has a stereotype of this sort to contend with. But I just wanted to give you another clip because it's of Charles Blow describing Charles Blow is an African American editorialist for the New York Times, and he's in this clip describing his reaction to the Trayvon Martin circumstance. And you can say, here's a guy that's accomplished as that, but because of the stereotypes about his group, he's having to deal with it as a kind of ongoing condition of life. And I want to get that dimension of the phenomenon conveyed, is how much it can be a dimension of life. So here he is on the Bill Maher show.
This is a very interesting point and part of the column I wrote last week, which is about the burden that young black men feel in this country. And it is a very heavy weight on their shoulders all the time, because you cannot behave like all of the rest of your friends. You have to watch. I mean, it's almost exhausting as a
You can't wear a hoodie.
Well, not only can you not wear a hoodie, but you literally are consciously paying attention to the way you move your body.
Right.
It is a physically exhausting exercise to know I can't run or make a sudden movement because now I see some cop standing on the corner and he's looking this way. Or I can't put my hands in my waistband, as George Zimmerman says that Trayvon Martin had his hands in his waistband, because that may signal that I have some sort of weapon. This kind of constant having to think about how you are positioning your body so that no one takes advantage of that and views you as suspicious and maybe takes your life or takes you to jail is exhausting.
So here's an experiment to give you a sense that I want to sort of change the focus a bit. Are there forms of white stereotype threat that are powerful? That was a question a student of mine and I ask ourselves. Are there forms? Well, yes, there are some incredibly intense forms of stereotype threat tied to race and to our history again. In interracial interactions, one of the risks is that there would be maybe a verbal slip or something, and a person might be seen as racist. And to be seen as racist is horrifying, just terrifying in modern society. So that's a form of stereotype. There's a stereotype about the group, and in this situation, it's relevant. And in this situation, I might have to wind up contending with that. So we did a simple experiment just to sort of, check this thinking. At Stanford, we had white males come into the laboratory one at a time, and we told them that there was going to be an experiment on a conversation. And they saw two pictures on the table of the people they were going to have a conversation with. And for half of them, the pictures were two black guys, and for the other half of them, the pictures were of two white guys. Then they find out that the topic of the conversation is either going to be something kind of innocuous, like love and relationships, which college students love to talk about, or it was going to be racial profiling. So you're going to talk to either two black guys or two white guys about love and relationships or racial profiling. And as soon as we explained that, the experimenter says, look, I'm going to go down the hall and get your conversation partners, and I'm going to bring them back for the conversation. Would you mind arranging the chairs in the room for this conversation? And there's 3 chairs in the room. And as you might imagine, as soon as they arrange those chairs, the experiment's basically over. That's kind of what we're interested in seeing, what they do. How do you position yourself for this kind of conversation? And you can predict the results. When they're going to talk to two white guys about anything, the chairs are really close together for a conversation. When they're going to talk to two black guys about love and relationships, the chairs are really close together for a conversation. But when they're going to talk to two black guys about racial profiling, they put the two black guys over here and themselves over here. They put a big distance between them. Distance starts to emerge. Attention starts to fill the room. And we have lots of measures to tell us what's going on. What they're thinking about, top of the head measures, kind of like Rorschach type measures, what they're thinking about is that stereotype, being seen as a racist in that conversation with these two guys who are black and strangers, and we're going to talk about racial profiling. And here's the interesting part. Who do you think put in that condition, put their chairs, because we have these measures, we have measured how prejudiced they are. in several different ways before the experiment begins. So we know kind of what the level of, and these are Stanford students, like Berkeley students. They're not, you don't find the real heavy negative end, but there is a variation in there. Who put their chairs farthest away from the two black guys in the condition where they're going to talk to two black guys about racial profiling? Was it the least prejudiced subjects or was it the most prejudiced subjects? Least. That's the person who has a lot to lose in the situation. I don't want to see myself that way. I don't want this interaction to go awry here. I've got more to lose. Somebody who isn't as invested in that, it doesn't make any difference. The stereotype threat effects are very weak in women in math, are very weak for women who are not really good and really identified with math. That's the women who show the effect. If you don't care about math, so I blew the test, It's like, let me get out of here. We did an amazingly funny study in Los Angeles in an inner city high school. We replicated one of the race studies there, and we had the kids divided up between those who cared about school and those who didn't care about school. And those who cared about school showed these big stereotype threat effects, and those that didn't care about school, they could just care. They didn't care whether it was an ability test or whether it was a puzzle, they just didn't care. They didn't do very well, but they didn't care about how the stereotype pressure was not there for them. So there's a subtext here which I think is important in getting toward the remedy. And the subtext is that this was so contrary to how we thought about this, and it's so contrary to how people initially react to this research. We thought it would be that, say, the women showing stereotype threat effects on a math test, that the women who showed it the most would be the women who were the least confident in math, and maybe had some esteem issues, and maybe, internalized the negative stereotype. But you can see from this pattern of data, the opposite is true. The opposite is true. The women that don't care about it don't show stereotype threat effects. They don't care enough about the domain to show them. The same is true in the race studies. The same is true in the athletic studies. The same is true in the social interaction studies. What makes a person subject to stereotype threat is, let's just call it for humor's sake, the mistake of identifying with a domain of performance where your group is seen negatively, like poor Eminem here. He made the mistake of trying to be a rapper. He was wandered all over the world and found the one domain where, where his group is negatively stereotyped and intellectually. That's what makes stereotype threat a press. And so what does make it strong or weak if it isn't some kind of internal low self-esteem that leads to a self-fulfilling prophecy? That is the standard lay psychology of American life. It's the standard interpretation of these group of performance effects that throughout the 20th century in psychology. We're responsible for that particular idea. And I'm arguing that that can happen after a long time, a long frustration of not succeeding in a domain where my group is negatively stereotyped. I might eventually give up and even concede, well, we're just not good at that. That can happen. I'm not denying the existence of it. But there's a vanguard of the group that is really identified with the domain and pushing against their performance limits, and that's the group that doesn't have these confidence problems. They've been good at this all their lives, and what they're dealing with is an outside pressure of how people might see them in this domain that's very important. And the strength of that pressure is determined not by something about their character or anything, it's by the cues in the situation that tell you you could be seen that way. It's really boneheadedly simple at some level. It's just, I walk into a room, there's nobody else there but who has this particular identity but me. I start to worry, or some part of my brain starts to worry that, geez, does this identity make a difference here, or does it not make a difference here? And I don't believe it, I don't even want to believe it, but I start combing through the cues, I start allocating attention to this. Somebody else comes in who's got the same identity as I do, and we get together and I start to, well, what do you see, man? And what? It's that kind of a phenomenon. Sandra Day O'Connor had a perfect example of this. I go on at length in the book. of being interviewed about her life, and at one point she's asked, how'd you feel when you were the first woman on the Supreme Court, the only woman on the Supreme Court? And her answer was, it was asphyxiating. Everywhere I went, the press followed me. Everything I did, everything I said was analyzed. Is she smart enough? Is she wise enough? Does she really merit being on this court? And they'd follow her into restaurants, and life was hell for her for a while. And then the interviewer says, well, what happened when Ruth Bader Ginsburg got there? And she said, well, everything changed. Everything changed. All of a sudden, there were 2 women on the Supreme Court, and it just didn't make the same sense to ask these questions about 2 different, very different, kind of politically different women. And she stopped feeling this pressure. She stopped receiving this pressure, and it kind of went away. Then Sandra Day O'Connor steps down, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg is left there alone, and she says she feels the pressure. She doesn't want it to be the case that a woman on the Supreme Court is something abnormal. So, thank goodness, on the Supreme Court, we got a critical mass there at this point. That question isn't so much the issue, but this story is an illustration of the concept of critical mass, which is the basis on which the University of Michigan defended its affirmative action policy, that you cannot bring onto a campus a group of people seen historically in a certain way, have them be a tiny group of people on a campus, and expect them not to feel these kind of pressures and have that interfere with their performance and their connection to certain curriculum, and you can't expect that. So you need to have a policy which, especially since we can't say that these selection criteria are the gold standards of promise that we'd like to present them as, especially since we can't say that, why don't we have a policy which liberalizes admissions a bit? And so they defended it, and as you know the story since then. It's the most beleaguered policy in the nation, and in California, it's illegal. Thanks to one of our regents, I suppose, who I guess I shouldn't go off on that tangent. Let's keep moving. So it's cues in a situation that make you feel that way. I can remember picking up a colleague at a former student at a Silicon Valley startup firm, and I went in the door, and all of a sudden I started feeling old. Like really old. Everybody in there was like, I think the oldest person was like 25, and there were bikes hanging from the ceiling, and there were dogs walking around, and there was music I hadn't heard before, and it was like, whoa, man, in my old psych department, I felt perfectly comfortable, maybe even a little bit young. But in that place, so it's all those cues that are telling you how to think about yourself, or what part of yourself is relevant here, possibly relevant here. And if I had to work in that place, in that firm, and I could really worry that my work would be seen in terms of how they see old people, and that could be like a big deal. So that's how it works. So on to the remedies. Well, first, I think you never want to take your eye off changing the way the organizations of our society that suggest stigmatization and negative stereotyping of certain groups. I'm old enough to remember, I start the book remembering my childhood of segregations, just these petty segregations. You could buy the clothes at the department store, but you couldn't change clothes. You couldn't try them on in the department stores. You could only go swimming on Wednesday afternoons in the public pool. You couldn't go swim. There's a whole list of things that the way in which society was organized at the time, which tell you haven't been thinking about that aspect of yourself at all when you're in the 3rd, 4th, 5th grade, but all of a sudden you're getting a message that this thing about you is like some kind of big deal, and it's not a good big deal. So the threat derives out of the way society is organized around these identities, period. We always look to the prejudiced heart. I forget that. This is too strong a statement. I don't really mean that. But the bigger problem is that society is, as a reflection of our history, organized around these kinds of identities. And that organization itself sends you a signal. If you are gay, you cannot get married. It's a heavy signal about that identity and what it means. And it conveys a huge, your whole life has to organize to deal with that. So if you really want to get past some of these things, get rid of some of those organizations that are around these kinds of identities, race, gender, social class, the like, minimize these things in a society, and I wouldn't ever want to take our eye off of those things. So that's the first thing to say with regard to remedy. It's political. I wish it wasn't, but it's political. The second things are, well, what can institutions do? Is there a skill set that institutions can develop to minimize these pressures of our history in important situations like universities, schools, where the institution is devoted to upward mobility and to the inclusion of people, ushering people into the mainstream of society and enabling them to function well there. An institution like that, schooling being, of course, the big one, is a place where we want to have as few of those pressures as possible. So there's a list of things to point to there. I think that a number of them will be familiar to you. Critical mass, I think, is important. We've done an ocean of research, and one thing you learn in all this research is that when you, on the basis of one identity or another, are one of a small number with that identity in a situation, we count. We count the number of other people in the situation who have that identity. We somehow track that. Right there, we allocate resources to monitoring. Well, what is this identity going to mean here? I'm listening to my son, a musician, in a club in New York, and I just find myself counting how many other gray heads there are in the room. Why? What's the relevance of that? At some level, you're appraising on an ongoing basis, well, what situation am I in here? And you try to quiet that part of your brain down. Don't do that. But if there aren't enough around, it's going to keep coming back. And it becomes a possible interpretation for what's happening to you. It becomes a possible interpretation that you just can't automatically dismiss. So it starts to afflict your life like that in a way. And critical mass calms that down a bit. There are some, and it doesn't have to be your own particular identity. It can be just a lot of identities. If you go to this area of the country, the Bay Area, San Francisco, New York, one of the great pleasures is that it tolerates a lot of identities. And all our particular identities just don't have to be seen as so threatening in environments like this. But if you're in some other situation where that's not so much the case, it's a very different experience. So critical mass is a big deal. Role models, existence proofs. The experience of being African American is different after Obama is elected than it was before Obama is elected. It does mean something that to live in a society where an African American can be the president of the United States versus being in a society where an African American cannot be the president of the United States. It sends a different message to everybody about what the society is about. It doesn't solve racial inequalities or economic, it doesn't do any, way too much hope for that. But it does create a different landscape for people. So role models, existence proofs are important. Valuing diversity as something that can contribute to the integrity of an institution as opposed to being in competition with excellence. We tend to see it as in competition with excellence. We've made some exceptions in order to be diverse because it's good, but we don't think it's really valuable to the integrity of an institution. Even though probably one of the major strengths of American society throughout its history is the diversity it's had available to draw on. That's probably the different perspectives, the different problems, the different ideas, the different values, the different that we've had to draw on to solve all of the problems, from how you govern yourself, to how you school yourself, to how you build buildings, to how you prepare food. This has been one of the major strengths of American society, and we should treat it like that it is something to be proud of, not something to see as a concession to some group that isn't really about excellence. It is excellence. It's the core of excellence. It is a major contributor to excellence. In any aspect, I believe, of knowledge creation, having a diverse set of perspectives working on something is as valuable, if not more valuable, than just having a group that's perhaps one increment better in skill. Diversity is where problems really get solved because you come in with a different perspective and you see things in a different way. And that helps people get to solutions and to be innovative in certain ways. When work groups get very homogeneous, they may get along very well together. We may celebrate ourselves, but we may lose something. So I push that argument pretty far in my thinking about things and how institutions should respond to it. I'll just list a few individual strategies, individual skill sets, which I think are important too, or useful, and then I'll stop and let you guys ask some questions. But certainly my former colleague, I have to remember where I am, Carol Dweck, has a beautiful idea, which is very popular these days, that you should think of abilities as expandable and incremental and not as fixed and genetically limited. Leads to a very different psychology. If you think that math is kind of God-given and either you got the capacity for it or you don't, then the first time you experience frustration in the domain, you say that it's not for me. It's just not for me. If you think of it as an expandable ability that requires time and maybe some immersion and maybe starting earlier in life, and you organize very differently with regard to that. And other societies compared to ours do have a much more incremental approach to intellectual abilities than Americans. We tend to be very much, a fixed capacity people, when perhaps societies where people do awfully well in the STEM fields have a much more incremental approach to it. I think that's a belief. What we're really talking about here is an ideology about ability. We don't know. It's beyond the reach of science at this point. We don't really know. So it's, what is your society's ideology about ability? Is it one where ability is more expandable? And if it is, then the whole stereotype threat and image threat isn't so serious. It isn't so deep. It isn't alleging something that isn't overcomable. If ability is something that's fixed, and the stereotype says you don't have it, and you're experiencing some frustration in a very elite institution, that's overpowering. Just boom, who's going to resist that and persist through all of that? So this is an individual skill, is to understand that abilities, as far as we understand them, probably the best simple phrase is the 10,000 hour rule. I think Malcolm Gladwell made it famous, but it's a whole area of psychology. When you look at everything from performance in math to musicianship, it tends to be, when did you start and how long and how did you do? Did you really do deliberate practice, and were you good at monitoring? You want to block it as opposed to just work constantly. Working constantly is not a really good thing in this area. You want to give yourself breaks. And so, did you have that kind of skill and coaching? And that's what seems to be the biggest predictor of whether people have really high ability in some area, is when they began and how much they worked at it. So that's an individual understanding of things that can be helpful. I could say a whole bunch of other things. You want to, when you give feedback to people, you want to affirm their potential to do things and then demand a lot out of them. You do not want to be easy with people. You want to affirm their potential, and then you want to demand a lot. That combination, that 1-2 punch, tells people that you're not seeing them stereotypically. You're seeing them as capable of doing it, and you're demanding it. That's a powerful individual strategy to use in teaching. Also, I think there's another individual skill is, as best as possible, having a rational narrative about your life and where you're at. I give the example of myself in graduate school and experiencing in the first year and a half, 2 years, an intense level of stereotype threat. Only African American in this graduate program, and the graduate program is all about who's smart, who's really, really smart, and like nobody in my group really was in that group of people who were the heroes in the field, and so, you know, without really being able to articulate it, I was in sort of personality lockdown. But then my advisor, not being particularly sophisticated in these matters, just treated me with that kind of, you're good, you can do this, and do it. Get that analysis done. And we had, and I felt a kind of freedom in that, really. He paid attention to me. And my narrative about the situation I was in changed. My understanding of the situation I was in changed. First, you feel like there's no hope for me. I'm just going to be seen this way. But then with that experience, you realize that's not the right narrative, that there is opportunity in this narrative. There is possibility in this narrative. So I think for us ourselves and for the students that we work with and come in contact with, it's working to get a really accurate, helpful narrative about the situation they're in. Not an overly politicized narrative one way or the other way, but an accurate narrative. Yes, the world does have prejudice in it. These stereotypes exist, but there's probably some room for you. And you can probably achieve, and if you achieve, you're going to be able to deflect that stereotype in certain ways. And so these are strategies that I think are helpful at the individual level. So I can stop at this point, and maybe there'll be a little time for questions. I don't know. I hope so. Thank you.
Logistical items, we have a microphone up here, if you want to come to the microphone, or an alternative. That is for the people who see the stream. An alternative is, you can shout out your question, maybe you can repeat it, so that those on the stream can hear.
Okay.
I have a question about whether you find the underperforming ways, I guess, for positive stereotypes as well. So, for example, as an Asian American, I'm seen to supposedly be, I struggle at it, mostly because I don't try hard enough. But do you see that that manifestation of underperforming as well with positive stereotypes as well?
Yeah, absolutely. The answer to that, yes. The question is, can you feel this kind of threat in the face of a positive stereotype? The black guy who joins the, I don't know, let's say the soccer team, and everybody on the team says, man, I'm happy to have you here because you're really fast. And are they really fast? So it puts you, or I did have Tom Liu, a Chinese graduate student once who wasn't that good in statistics, and he went out on the job market, and everybody said, well, great, man, we can, if you come here, you can teach statistics, and it terrified him. So absolutely, the stereotypes can go that way. Stereotype threat can go that way. Yes?
You speak about pressure, and I was wondering, how do you reconcile this pressure? Is it through like a self-affirmation? Like how can you, because you may not know what you're going to be walking into, but perhaps these moments happen. They're all around us. So what can we say to ourselves to brace ourselves so we don't have those negative voices or those perceptions that go against what our abilities.
Yeah, the question there is, how do you brace yourself for these pressures, and when they happen to you, how do you explain them in a way that reduces the threat and the immobility that they might otherwise cause? And that's what I think the first thing that comes to mind. There are a number of strategies. Self-affirmations are one. I haven't talked about that a lot, so people may not know exactly what that formally refers to. But the accuracy of your narrative, I think, is a good a good thing to focus on is just for everyday life, is to try to have an understanding of the context that doesn't completely maybe ignore and the possibility of a threat, that doesn't go into false consciousness, as one might say, but that recognizes that there is room in this situation for me to be appreciated, and that there is a sense of belonging here. I do belong here. Under extreme circumstances, that may be a lot of work to maintain that kind of narrative, but probably in many of the circumstances that we live in today, and many of the forms of stereotype threat-driven underperformance we're concerned about, it is rational to understand the environment as not so menacing and not so threatening. When I was in graduate school, that's kind of what happened, is that I eventually came to the view, most of these people, they don't care about you, for one thing. They're not thinking about you that much. And they are capable of being impressed with what you do. And if you, I remember getting a paper published. When I got a paper published, it was like, wow, man, I belong. So there are achievements that mark that for you and change the narrative. And whereas I think it is a struggle, that work of working through the right kind of narrative about things, I think it can be done. And I think everybody has that in some way or another. Joining a profession, joining adult life, joining relationships. We all have that kind of work to do with regard to understanding things in a way that that's both realistic, but that gives us some sense of safety and belongingness in the situation. Oh, you came to the mic, so you get.
Good afternoon. I'm LaShonda King. I really thank you for sharing your research with us. I'm a Berkeley alum and I'm a Berkeley staff member. While I was a student here, I took a class in this classroom. I felt the stereotype threat a lot on campus. This classroom, Ed 40AC, taught by Pedro Noguera, was one of the first places I felt like I had a voice on this campus. As a student here, I was here for 3 years and I left and went to Spelman for a whole school year. And for those who don't know, Spelman is a historically Black women's college, and so that alleviated 2 of the stereotypes from being at Berkeley, eliminated being a woman on this campus and a woman of color. And so I noticed personally that I was on the honor roll and had a substantially higher GPA for that year when I was at Spelman, and I always attributed to the smaller classes and this and this and that, but this brings a different light on things for me, and I'm wondering if any of these studies have been replicated at more homogeneous institutions, schools, or anything to kind of validate it as a different way to look at it.
Yeah, no, you hit a real important feature, and one that I wish I was completely comfortable with, but I think it has to be said that in those kind of environments, if you want your child, African American, to become a doctor, you're probably better off today sending them to a historically Black college or university. Just if you look at the statistics involved, that those schools educate about 16% of African American college students in the United States, but they graduate almost 70% of all the African Americans who wind up with careers in the STEM fields, and that includes physicians and dentists and the like, and you can get similar patterns for women in women's schools.
Yes.
So now, having said that, the other side of me, maybe the more fundamental side of me, that will never work. We need to make these universities work for people. We need to figure out how to make these universities work if we're going to have the kind of society we want in the long run. We have to figure out what educators have to do from K through 16 or 20, I don't know what, to overcome these kind of pressures, get them. We have to be frank about them and get on to getting rid of them, I think, is the bigger solution.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Brenea Blue. I'm a college advisor for the College of Letters and Science. Thank you so much for your lecture today. Regarding the individual skill sets and role models being remedies, specifically for the elementary school students, in particular Black males, do you know of any model programs or schools that are addressing or doing a good job with providing the role models and individual skill sets to combat stereotype threat?
I wish I did know more about that. You always hear of programs that are very effective, but they tend to be isolated programs, and you don't tend to get a kind of summary interpretation of what's making them successful. So they definitely exist. I've got hunches about them. You know, when I was in New York, I was very impressed with the Harlem Children's Zone. That seemed to be like a real wraparound approach to the phenomenon that I thought was very effective. But you just reliably, let's just take the Bay Area, you reliably find underperformance in those, throughout our K through 12 system and throughout our higher education system. You reliably still find that. So I don't think we found the general approach that in integrated schools, identity integrated schools, weakens these pressures so much that it eliminates them. And of course, there are other sources of those differences. I don't want to claim that psychology is everything. I don't want to psychologize away huge structural differences in the advantage and preparation for these communities. I mean, the more you look, the more you find in getting kids ready for school. 3 things are very predictive of their entry-level skills and test scores. How much you talk to your children in a negotiating way, that's one thing. Do you negotiate things as opposed to top-down instruction? Negotiate. How much you read to them, and how much you take them to non-routine environments. To the zoo, to Europe if you can, to, I don't know, Las Vegas. That doesn't sound right. To the Giants game, let's say that. Take them places and they get lit up, and that tends to lead them to be very interested in the things that produce skills. So there's a lot we know, but I can't point to something that works in a way I understand it. Yes.
I'm Leah Carroll from the Office of Undergraduate Research, and the National Science Foundation has put a lot of money into research experiences for undergraduates, which are aimed at underrepresented students in the STEM fields. Listening to your talk, it occurs to me that it's kind of a double-edged sword, because it's, on the one hand, it's kind of saying you need extra help, but on the other hand, it's true. So, what would your...
How do you handle that one, huh? Yeah. Well, yes, the question is, funders, National Science Foundation, among them, have invested in programs that are targeted toward underrepresented minorities, and that can be a double-edged sword because it sends both the message, come in, but at the same time it sends the message that you need help. This is a classic, I'll call it institutional challenge. And I think there are ways around that. And I think some of the things I was suggesting are helpful, like affirming potential and at the same time demanding a lot, making these things be accelerated as opposed to remedial. If they get to be remedial, then I don't think it's worth it. I think the stereotype can be so, especially on a campus like this that's elite. It's about how, everybody knows it's about how smart you are, and you've got a public identity as being based on something about you in need of remediation. That's a disaster. That was a naive way in which we implemented affirmative action perhaps earlier, and I think it's an extremely costly way to do that, and I think it's one of the things that drives that underperformance I was talking about, is that that kind of adaptation. But I don't think we need to do that at all. And I also don't think these programs need to be focused just on one group. I think they can be focused on much more generally and be much more effective and helpful for lots of people. That's my view. Now, whether I can make the National Science Foundation see it that way in time, it's a life mission. But I think it's important that we, as a society, get a more enlightened view about these things. You can't do it that way. You can't stigmatize them as you help them. That's not going to do it. Okay, one more question. Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. The question is, in many of the examples I give, the experience of stereotype threat seems to be emotional and involve your value commitment to some domain of life. You want to really succeed there because you value it, your family values it, your society values it, you know you need it for a whole bunch of reasons. You're there, and then to experience this threat in it, a lot of the interference is emotional. I couldn't agree with you more, and I think we're just I've spent a couple years, I consider it kind of like graduate school in education, being a dean of a graduate school of education, and I love them. I love that mission. I am an educator. But one thing I think we do as educators is to see education way too much as an intellectual enterprise and less as an emotional, socio-emotional enterprise and an identity-based enterprise. I think it's much more that than we think it is. How much more, I don't know exactly how to say, but a lot of us, when you actually look at people who've been very successful, you learn how to read, you learn it because you want to. And most kids do really want to learn these things. And if they're given access, they really make a lot of progress. I mean, I've got 2 5-year-old grandkids now, which I love to watch. Not to be around all the time. I have to, after having a weekend, Father's Day, I'm ready to move on. But I mean, they're just fascinating how much they want to learn things and how capable they are of learning things. And we think of that as something to do with your intellectual capacities. I think it's about your emotional, your interests, the things that make you a human. And I think we way underappreciate these things. We try to reduce kids and students to being, brains on sticks or something, and not full. And we've got to understand that, I think, to really have our education be effective for a much broader sweep of the population. We've got this challenge now in higher education and in education in general of educating effectively a much broader population than we have ever had before. And a lot of what is going to, I think, have to be solved in order to do that well are the kind of problems that you're thinking of, is the social psychological, the social emotional connection to schooling and to performance in schooling and to intellectual life. We're going to have to learn how to scaffold those things better to be effective for who we really are as a population. Well, thank you very much. It was a big pleasure.